What's the most ridiculous trial you can imagine? Now, what if I told you the defendant had been buried for months? In the year 897, the Vatican staged a courtroom drama so bizarre that historians still struggle to explain it. A pope, sitting on the throne, accusing another pope, one who couldn't speak, couldn't move, and, well, let's just say he wasn't exactly in the mood for a defense. So why would the most powerful man in Rome drag his predecessor back into the spotlight? Literally. Let's rewind. Hey guys, tonight we slip into the narrow, winding veins of medieval Rome, a place where torchlight flickers against cracked walls and the air smells faintly of incense and sewage. It's the late 9th century, and you're standing in the middle of a city that's technically the beating heart of Christendom. But it feels more like the world's largest haunted house. Every creak of a wooden door in the distance makes you glance over your shoulder. Every shadow looks like it might have a dagger tucked inside its folds. And here's the kicker. You're about to hear a story so strange, you probably won't survive it without blinking twice and muttering, "Wait, what?" So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I want to see who's still awake with me at this weird hour. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wander past to the crumbling outlines of old imperial forums, their columns now leaning like tired old men. Stray dogs nose through piles of refuse, and somewhere in the distance, a lute plucks a melody that feels older than the stones beneath your feet. Rome isn't the marble perfection of Augustus anymore. It's a battered chessboard where bishops, dukes, and papal guards play their moves with real human lives as pawns. The people you pass in the street don't smile easily. A merchant haggling over olives glares when you linger too long. The whispers that drift between market stalls aren't about the weather. They're about who's been seen slipping into whose villa at night, and which noble family is plotting against the current pope. You feel it. The city is a living rumor mill, and it's about to churn out its strangest story yet. By day, the papal processions still wind through the streets with glittering banners and gilded crosses, but even those feel brittle, like a performance held together with frayed thread. At night, the power struggles reveal themselves. Armed guards in mismatched armor patrol corners where their allegiance is as uncertain as the moon's reflection in the Tiber. You pause near the massive Lateran Basilica. By candlelight, it looms more like a fortress than a holy place. Its doors are heavy oak, bound with iron, the kind that could keep people out or in. You can almost imagine the echoes of centuries-old arguments bouncing off its stone walls. This is not the Rome of peaceful saints. This is a Rome where religious robes hide sharpened ambitions, and where theology debates turn into street fights. And in this setting, the papacy is less of a spiritual calling and more of a crown in a perpetual tug-of-war. You can smell the tension the way you'd smell wood smoke before you see the fire. The streets you're walking tonight have seen emperors, barbarian sieges, and centuries of intrigue. But even they aren't ready for what's coming. A trial, yes, an actual trial, is on the horizon. But the accused? They won't be speaking in their own defense. In fact, they won't be speaking at all. For now, though, all you hear are the quiet rustles of cloaked figures slipping through the alleys, their sandals whispering against the cobblestones. A man selling wine murmurs to a customer about something unbelievable that's going to happen in the basilica. You catch the phrase papal justice and unholy business in the same sentence, a combination you don't hear every day. Above you, the sky is an uneven patchwork of clouds, the moon cutting through only enough to make the shadows sharper. You keep walking, past a shrine tucked into a wall, its candlelight trembling in the breeze, and the whole time there's that prickling sensation at the back of your neck, the one that tells you the city knows something you don't. Yet. For now, you're just a traveler passing through the most dangerous kind of story, one that hasn't decided who it's going to swallow yet. You don't meet Pope Formosus at the height of his glory. Not yet. For now, picture him as a younger man, a bishop with sharp eyes and a diplomat's patience, moving through the choked corridors of Vatican politics like someone who knows every squeaky floorboard. He's not the kind of priest who hides in a study with parchment and ink. He's the kind who travels, negotiates, and, whether he admits it or not, makes enemies along the way. You hear his name first in whispers, in a city that already knows it's hard to rise without stepping on toes. Born in the mid-9th century, Formosus starts his ecclesiastical career as the Bishop of Porto, a port city that feeds Rome's belly and its ambitions. It's a good post, close enough to the papal heart to feel its pulse, but far enough to watch the games from a safer distance. And he's good at it. Too good. The man has a knack for diplomacy, sent as a papal legate to the Bulgarians and the Franks, speaking in the polite but loaded language of church envoys. These aren't just religious missions. They're political balancing acts, like tightrope walking in a storm. Formosus doesn't just survive them. He comes back with deals, alliances, and the faintest glimmer of being the man you send when you need the impossible done. Of course, in Rome, competence is dangerous. It makes you useful, but it also makes you a threat. And in the medieval church, where theology and real estate are often two sides of the same coin, threats have a way of being neutralized. Historians still argue whether Formosus was truly ambitious or simply swept along by forces bigger than himself. His enemies saw ambition in every step he took. They accused him of desertion, of coveting other seas, of conspiring with political powers who'd rather have the Pope in their pocket. At one point, he's even excommunicated. Yes, the man who will one day be Pope is officially booted from the church. It's a reminder that Rome's memory is long, but its grudges are even longer. Yet, somehow, Formosus weathers it. Time passes, alliances shift, and eventually, the slate is wiped clean enough for him to return. His skill in navigating chaos becomes his calling card. He doesn't just climb back into favor. He climbs all the way to the papal throne in 891 AD. You picture him on the day of his coronation, the mitre gleaming under the basilica's light, his robes immaculate, his face set in that expression all popes learn, serene, but never still. By then, Rome itself is a mess of factions. The Carolingian dynasty is sputtering in the north. Local nobility are carving up influence, and every throne, secular or sacred, feels like a seat over a pit of snakes. Formosus finds himself trying to balance the interests of powerful Italian dukes with the looming presence of Arnulf of Carinthia, the Frankish king who has his own ideas about who should control Rome. Formosus plays both sides as best he can. He invites Arnulf into Italy, perhaps hoping for stability. Maybe he even believes a strong Frankish hand could quiet the endless bickering of Rome's noble families. But backing a foreign ruler is like betting your house on a stranger's dice roll. You might win everything, or lose more than you can afford. This is where the cracks start forming beneath his feet. Every decision he makes ripples outward, touching the wrong egos, stirring the wrong rivalries. And while he's dealing with invasions, coronations, and rebellions, somewhere in the background, future Pope Stephen VI is watching. Waiting. You'd think that being Pope means you're untouchable. But in Rome at this time, the papal throne is more like a revolving chair over a trapdoor. One wrong move, and it's someone else's turn to sit in it, while you're lying very still in the crypt below. Formosus dies in 896 AD, probably thinking he's escaped the worst of his political storms. He's buried in the papal vestments of his office, lowered into the ground with the solemn dignity that comes with the title. Rome breathes, shrugs, and moves on to the next pope. That's how it usually works. But not this time. Because death, at least for Formosus, is not the end of the story. It's just the intermission. And in the next act, he won't even be alive to defend himself. By now, you've probably guessed that Rome doesn't do quiet transitions. When one pope dies, the next doesn't just step up to a warm chair and a fresh cup of wine. No, he walks into a minefield left behind by centuries of grudges, rivalries, and family feuds, so tangled they make soap opera plots look minimalist. The city is ruled not only by the church, but by a handful of noble clans whose family trees are less branches and more vines choking each other. These aren't just landowners. They're kingmakers, cardinals, and shadowy benefactors who can make or break a papacy with a few whispered words. You can't stroll across the forum without brushing shoulders with someone whose cousin's marriage once tipped the balance of who sat on the papal throne. And at the heart of these tangled allegiances are two main forces: the pro-Frankish faction, who believe the future of Rome lies in alliance with northern kings like Arnulf, and the pro-Spoleto camp, led by the powerful dukes of Spoleto, who have zero interest in Frankish influence over Italy. Pope Formosus, in his lifetime, made the fatal mistake of leaning too far toward the Frankish side. He crowned Arnulf as Holy Roman Emperor, a move that pleased some but infuriated others, especially the Spoletans. They saw it as an insult to their power, a threat to their influence over the papacy, and a very personal betrayal. Historians still argue whether Formosus acted out of political necessity, genuine belief, or sheer desperation to keep Rome stable. Whatever his reason, the Dukes of Spoleto didn't forgive him. And when the tides turned, they began setting the stage for a reckoning that would come after his death. It's easy to think the papacy was purely a spiritual role in this era, but that's a modern illusion. In reality, it was a high-stakes political office with divine branding. The Pope wasn't just a shepherd of souls, he was a power broker with armies at his disposal and lands to control. That meant every pope was, by definition, in someone's way. The rival factions weren't polite about it either. There were rumors of poisoned wine, of accidents involving loose stones falling from rooftops, of midnight stabbings blamed on nameless thieves. And while no one could accuse a noble openly without risking their own neck, everyone understood that politics here wasn't a game. It was survival. Stephen VI, the man who would later preside over the Cadaver Synod, owed his papacy to the pro-Spoleto faction. They backed his election, perhaps seeing him as a pliable candidate who would repay his debt in loyalty. But Stephen wasn't entirely without ambition of his own. If you're raised in the Roman clerical system, you don't get to the top without knowing how to maneuver. You can imagine the conversations in smoky chambers late at night. Advisors leaning in, voices low, reminding Stephen that Formosus's legacy still cast a shadow, that the Frankish crown might still reach south, that the people needed to see visibly, undeniably, that the Spoleto camp had won. It wasn't enough that Formosus was gone. His memory had to be discredited, his decisions undone, his supporters humiliated. And there was only one way to do that in Rome: a trial. Not for his followers, not for his allies, for Formosus himself. You can almost picture the smirk on some noble's face as the idea took root. Put the man on trial posthumously, parade his crimes before the city, and strip away every shred of honor he left behind. It would be the ultimate public relations coup, a warning to anyone else who thought they could oppose Spoleto interests. Of course, there's a practical problem with putting someone on trial after they've died. Namely, the whole not alive thing. But in 9th century Rome, that wasn't seen as an obstacle. If anything, it was a feature. After all, a dead man can't argue back. The stage was set, the factions aligned, and somewhere deep in the vaults of the Lateran, a tomb was about to be opened. The kind of opening that wasn't for relic veneration or holy ceremony, but for dragging an old enemy into the light one last time. Stephen VI doesn't walk into the papal throne like a man inheriting a peaceful kingdom. He slides into it like someone stepping onto a patch of thin ice, knowing it might crack at any second. The robes are heavy, the crown gleams, but the air around him is thick with expectation. The people who put him here, the Dukes of Spoleto and their allies, aren't subtle about what they want. They didn't back him for his theological insight. They backed him to secure their grip on Rome. You can almost see him in the papal chambers on his first nights, pacing in soft leather shoes over cold marble, staring out at the dark city beyond the palace windows. A flickering oil lamp casts long shadows across the walls, as if even the furniture is watching him. He knows his position is fragile. Outside these walls, rumors have a way of moving faster than blessings. Inside them, loyalty is rented by the weak. Formosus's ghost, figurative for now, still lingers in the streets. His supporters haven't all faded away. Some remain in the curia, others in the noble houses, and still others in the crowd that gathers for mass. His political decisions, especially his coronation of Arnulf, are still shaping alliances. And for Stephen, every one of those lingering ties feels like a loose thread that could be pulled to unravel him. Historians still argue whether Stephen was personally obsessed with Formosus, or whether he was simply pressured into the synod by the Spoleto faction. Maybe it was both. Power in Rome rarely came from one motive. It was always a stew of self-interest, vengeance, and fear. Whatever the mix, the outcome was the same. The decision was made to put Formosus on trial. And not just any trial, a trial unlike anything the city had ever seen before. The whispers start as a trickle in the corridors of the Lateran, the basilica that doubles as papal residence and seat of justice. The idea is so audacious, so grotesque, that it spreads like wine spilling across a table. At first, it's spoken as if it might be a joke, some wild hypothetical to shock the new cardinals. But soon, it's clear. They're serious. Stephen calls a council. You imagine the room. Bishops in heavy robes, some leaning forward eagerly, others keeping their eyes fixed on the floor, as if hoping invisibility will save them. The plan is outlined. Formosus will be exhumed, dressed in full papal regalia, and brought into the basilica to face charges of perjury, of violating canon law, of holding multiple bishoprics at once. There's a thin layer of legal justification. They claim the church must cleanse itself of unlawful acts, even retroactively. But peel that away, and the real motive is naked. Political theater. A spectacle to humiliate the memory of Formosus and terrify anyone tempted to follow in his political footsteps. Not everyone in the room agrees. A few bishops murmur about sacrilege, about the danger of mocking the sanctity of the office. But their voices are drowned out by louder, more insistent ones. In the end, opposition isn't just ignored, it's dangerous. Disagree too openly, and you might find yourself the next example in whatever madness this is turning into. So the plan moves forward. The guards receive their instructions. Coffin keys are fetched. Tailors are summoned to prepare the ceremonial garments. And somewhere in the basilica's deep shadowed halls, a place is being readied for the strangest courtroom drama in history. Stephen, for his part, knows he's playing with fire. But in his mind, this is the kind of blaze you control to burn away the undergrowth before it chokes you. If he can erase Formosus's legitimacy, he can nullify his decrees, strip his allies of their power, and tighten the Spoleto grip on Rome. The city beyond the basilica's walls begins to hum with anticipation. No official announcement is made, at least not yet. But secrets like this in Rome are like trying to hide a bonfire under a bedsheet. Merchants talk about it while weighing figs. Tavern keepers pass it along with the wine. And the people begin to imagine what it will look like when a pope stands trial against a pope. You don't have to be a theologian to know it's going to be ugly. Tut. The order goes out quietly, almost politely. At least as politely as you can request the exhumation of a former pope. Somewhere in the guarded corridors of the Lateran, a small group of trusted men receives the task. They are not to speak of it outside the walls. They are not to linger over the work. And above all, they are to make sure the body is presentable. You follow them in your mind's eye as they move through the basilica's darkened cloisters toward the burial vault. The air grows cooler, heavier, the scent of stone and candle wax giving way to the musty tang of earth. The guards posted at the tomb stand stiff, eyes flicking to the floor as the order is read aloud. They know better than to ask why. The coffin is hauled up from its resting place with an awkward scraping sound, like something the earth doesn't want to release. The wood creaks, the ropes strain. One man mutters a prayer under his breath. Another spits into the dust to ward off ill fortune. You don't need to see inside to feel the shift in the room. Suddenly, the task has crossed from political to profane. Historians still argue whether the body of Formosus was in any condition to be moved without falling apart. Some accounts claim he was mostly intact, preserved by the vault's cool dryness. Others suggest he was little more than a crumbling relic, bones loosely held together by what remained of his burial robes. Either way, the men handling him must have worked slowly, careful not to break the macabre centerpiece of what's to come. The papal vestments are prepared in advance. Rich white linen, a crimson stole, a gold-embroidered chasuble, the triple-tiered tiara. The garments are laid out in a chamber lit by flickering lamps, their colors almost garish against the pallor of stone walls. Dressing a corpse for trial isn't something the church has a manual for, so the attendants improvise, draping the robes over limbs that no longer bend easily, adjusting the folds to hide what time has taken. The ring of St. Peter, symbol of papal authority, is slipped onto a withered finger. Crozier in hand, Formosus is made to look, from a distance at least, like a pope ready to preside over Mass. Up close, it's another matter entirely. The stillness is too complete, the skin too taut, the air faintly metallic with decay. They choose the hour carefully for the move, late enough at night that the streets are quiet. early enough that the basilica can be prepared before the curious arrive. The body is carried in on a wooden chair, flanked by guards who keep their eyes fixed straight ahead. Outside, the city sleeps, unaware that history's strangest trial is being set in place piece by piece. Inside the Lateran Basilica, a special platform has been built. It's draped in cloth of gold, backed by a carved wooden throne. This will be the defendant's seat. The image is as surreal as it is deliberate. To make the people see not just a body, but the Pope he once was, only now silent, powerless, and about to be condemned. One clerk, unable to help himself, mutters that it feels like a passion play gone wrong. Another shushes him sharply. Humor, even nervous humor, is dangerous here. Stephen VI visits the setup before dawn. You picture him pausing at the foot of the platform, studying his predecessor's face, or what's left of it. Maybe there's satisfaction there. Maybe just grim necessity. Whatever he feels, he doesn't linger. There's much to arrange. The bishops who will serve as judges, the deacon who will act as Formosus's voice, the script of charges to be read aloud. By the time the sun rises over Rome, the coffin is gone, the tomb stands empty, and Formosus is seated upright in the basilica's grand nave, dressed in the glory of the papal office, waiting for a trial that will redefine the word absurd. And somewhere out in the city, the first whispers of what's about to happen are slipping through the morning air, making their way toward every ear that thrives on scandal. Morning in Rome feels different when there's scandal brewing. The usual clatter of mule hooves on cobblestone, the hawking of figs and bread in the market. It's all still there, but you sense an extra hum under it. Word has spread faster than the smoke from 100 hearths. Something strange is happening in the Lateran Basilica today. And in a city that thrives on spectacle, strange is the perfect bait. By mid-morning, they're coming in from every quarter. Merchants in worn tunics, noblewomen in veils, barefoot apprentices trailing their masters. A few clutch rosaries, others carry nothing but curiosity. The basilica looms ahead, its great doors flung open like a mouth about to tell a dangerous secret. Inside, the cool air smells of incense and dust, the mingled perfumes of the sacred and the ancient. Candles flicker along the walls, throwing restless light onto the mosaics overhead. The central aisle is roped off, guiding the crowd toward the edges where they can stand, crane their necks, and whisper into each other's ears. At the far end of the nave, the scene is already set. Bishops in gleaming vestments take their seats like actors in a play they've rehearsed in silence. Their faces are studiously neutral, but their eyes flick to one another with unspoken questions. Some are here willingly. Others are here because refusing an invitation from Pope Stephen VI is a career-limiting move, possibly a life-limiting one. And then there's the defendant, propped upright on a throne, draped in full papal regalia, is the unmistakable figure of Pope Formosus, or what remains of him. The crimson and gold shimmer in the candlelight. The tiara sits squarely on his head, and in his right hand rests the crozier. But the skin is darkened, the eyes are sunken hollows, and the stillness is the kind only the grave can teach. The crowd reacts in ripples. The first gasp comes from a young acolyte near the front. It travels outward, turning into murmurs, a few nervous laughs, and more than one sign of the cross. A merchant near you mutters that he's seen mules dressed better for market day. Another snaps at him to hush. This is holy business. even if it feels like madness. Historians still argue whether the people of Rome were horrified or entertained by the sight. Some chroniclers suggest there was a carnival atmosphere. Others say the mood was heavy with unease, as if everyone knew they were witnessing a line being crossed. In truth, it was probably both. Half morbid curiosity, half moral dread. Stephen VI enters at last, his robes whispering over the marble floor. He doesn't hurry. The crowd parts slightly, heads bow, but the tension is sharp enough to taste. He ascends to his place opposite the throne where Formosus sits, a living pope facing a silent one, and for a moment the symmetry is almost artistic. The bishops begin the opening prayers, their Latin echoing against the high vaults. It's familiar ritual in an unfamiliar setting, like hearing a lullaby sung at a funeral. Then the charges are read aloud. Perjury, violation of canon law, ambition beyond his station. The voice carrying them belongs to a deacon, poor soul, appointed to act as Formosus's defender. He stands beside the throne, addressing the corpse as though expecting an answer. "Do you deny these charges?" he asks, his voice trembling just enough to betray him. The silence is suffocating. Of course, there's no reply. The deacon swallows, glances at the bishops, and continues, asking question after question, each one met with the same still, hollow gaze. You feel the absurdity pressing in from all sides. The grandeur of the basilica, the solemnity of the vestments, the centuries-old weight of church law, all of it now bent around a performance that feels like a fever dream. And yet, for all its strangeness, it's deadly serious. This isn't theater for theater's sake. This is power flexing in the most unmissable way possible, showing that even in death, an enemy can be dragged into the light and made to kneel. The crowd doesn't leave. If anything, more press in through the doors, drawn by the whispers of what's happening inside. No one knows how far Stephen will take this. And you, standing at the back, have the uneasy sense that the day is far from over. The human mind is good at forgetting things it can't reconcile. But not today. No matter how much you blink, the image doesn't soften. Pope Formosus, seated like a marionette whose strings have long since rotted away, stares, or seems to stare, straight ahead. His crozier leans slightly in his hand, as if even the staff can't bear the weight of this scene. The bishops have fallen into a rhythm, reading each charge with the flat cadence of men who don't want their own names remembered in connection with this day. Perjury. Breaking the prohibition on transferring from one bishopric to another. Ambition unbecoming the head of Christendom. The words are sharp in theory, but when flung at a man who hasn't drawn breath in months, they hang in the air like smoke with nowhere to go. Historians still argue whether Stephen VI believed in the legitimacy of these charges or simply used them as a political club. Some say he genuinely wanted to cleanse the church of what he saw as illegal acts. Others suspect he was staging a morality play for his Spoleto patrons, a public unmasking designed to erase Formosus from memory. Beside the throne, the deacon continues his grim pantomime of defense. His role is to speak on Formosus's behalf, but every question is met with silence. "Did you unlawfully seize the See of Rome?" he asks, and then waits, as if the dead might reconsider and give a confession for the ages. The crowd shifts uneasily. A woman in a simple linen veil grips her rosary so hard the beads leave imprints in her skin. A merchant near her leans forward on his toes, fascinated. Someone coughs. The sound echoes far too loudly in the cavernous nave. And through it all, Stephen VI watches. His gaze doesn't flicker, doesn't soften. It's as if he's waiting for the moment when the city collectively understands the point. This is what happens to those who cross the wrong side of Rome's power lines. The absurdity grows heavier with every exchange. One bishop clears his throat before accusing the corpse of lying under oath, an oath taken in a voice no one can now hear. Another recites passages from canon law, his tone so precise it might as well be a lecture to a classroom, if not for the fact that his student is already in the grave. At one point, the deacon seems to hesitate, his eyes flicking toward the crowd as though searching for escape. But there is none. He asks his next question, perhaps knowing it will meet the same stone wall of silence, and the trial grinds onward. You can almost feel the moment when the crowd begins to accept the rules of this surreal theater. The initial shock has worn down to a kind of morbid curiosity. People lean to whisper theories about what Formosus might have done to deserve this. Some nod in approval at Stephen's show of authority. Others glance toward the door, unsure if watching this will stain their souls. The great basilica swallows every sound except the ritual voices and the occasional shuffle of feet. Dust motes spin lazily in the high beams of sunlight, slanting through narrow windows, the only sign that time is moving forward. And still, the charges keep coming. Still, the questions keep being asked. Still, the accused sits there, dressed in the glory of his former office, as unmoving as the marble saints in the niches above. If you didn't know better, you'd think the trial might go on forever. But in Rome, nothing lasts forever. Not power, not alliances, and certainly not the patience of those in charge. Soon, the performance will give way to the verdict. And in a court where the outcome is preordained, that's when the real message will be delivered. The air in the basilica seems to cool as the litany of charges nears its end. Though maybe it's just your imagination, or the way everyone's breath feels shallow now. The trial has become less a dialogue and more a drumbeat. Accusation, silence, accusation, silence. Every repetition hammers the point deeper, as if they're trying to carve it into the collective memory of the crowd. The final charges echo off the marble, formal and unyielding. They accuse Formosus of violating the sacred boundaries of the church, of betraying the trust of his office, of sitting in the chair of St. Peter while unworthy to touch its base. The words are steeped in the language of sin, but in this context, they sound almost like political slogans in holy robes. And then Stephen VI rises. He doesn't need to raise his voice. The hush that falls is instant, absolute. Every eye turns toward him as he steps forward, his robes whispering over the marble. You notice how deliberately he moves. Not a gesture wasted, not a step too quick. His hand rests briefly on the arm of his chair before he begins to speak. In a voice as measured as it is cold, Stephen lays out the summary of the case. He recounts Formosus's alleged misdeeds with the precision of someone slicing a loaf thin enough to see light through. Each crime is framed not just as a violation of church law, but as an offense against the stability of Rome itself. Historians still argue whether Stephen believed this rhetoric, or if it was a mask for raw vengeance. Some see in his tone a zealot's conviction. Others hear only the careful cadence of a man performing for an audience of patrons who expect their enemies to be crushed, literally, if necessary. And then comes the moment no one truly doubted would arrive. The verdict. Stephen pronounces Formosus guilty on all counts. The words hang in the incense-thick air. A formal condemnation of a man who cannot flinch, cannot bow his head, cannot protest. The deacon standing at his side lowers his eyes, as if the outcome were a weight pressing down on his shoulders alone. But in Rome, a verdict is never just words. There must be a sentence, a visible act to make the ruling real. Stephen declares that Formosus is to be stripped of all papal dignity. The crowd stirs, unsure of what that means in practice, until the first attendants step forward. With deliberate slowness, they remove the tiara from Formosus's head. The gold catches the light for a moment before it's carried away. Next goes the stole, the chasuble, each piece of embroidered fabric lifted like a relic and then folded out of sight. The crozier is taken from his withered hand. The papal ring slid from his finger. One by one, the symbols of his authority vanish, leaving him slumped in plain burial linen. The transformation is jarring. In minutes, the grandeur of the Pope has been peeled away, leaving only the undeniable reality of the man beneath. And then comes the part that makes even some of Stephen's allies glance at each other uneasily. Following ancient tradition for deposing bishops, the fingers of Formosus's right hand, the ones used to bless, are cut off. The act is ceremonial, symbolic, and, in the eyes of many in the room, deeply unsettling when performed on someone long buried. A ripple moves through the crowd, a mix of gasps, murmurs, and the faint shuffle of those who've decided they've seen enough. But Stephen's gaze remains steady. This is the theater he promised his patrons. This is the warning he intends to leave etched in Rome's memory. The sentence is complete. The trial is over. And yet, you have the unmistakable sense that the story isn't. Because in this city, even a verdict carved in marble can be chipped away by the next shift in power. If the trial itself was unsettling, what followed was a descent into something stranger, something that felt less like justice and more like a grim pageant. The formalities were over. Now came the part that people would talk about in markets, over wine jugs, and in whispered gossip for years. The ritual humiliation. The attendants didn't move quickly. That would have made it seem like a chore to be completed. No. This was a slow, deliberate stripping of dignity, already begun when the papal vestments were removed. Formosus, once robed in shimmering silk and gold, now sat in plain linen, slumped slightly to one side, as if his body were finally remembering it had been in the grave. And still, the deacon stood beside him, like a ghost of duty refusing to leave. You can almost feel the man's discomfort radiating into the heavy basilica air. His part in this charade is done, yet he stays, perhaps because walking away would draw more eyes than standing still. Stephen VI watches the whole thing like a director seeing his script come to life. To him, the silence of Formosus isn't just the absence of speech, it's a prop. A perfect tool to prove the point that power doesn't protect you forever. Historians still argue about Stephen's motives here. Was this grotesque theater born of personal vendetta? Was it simply political obedience to the Dukes of Spoleto? Or was it something else? An attempt to stamp his authority on a city where the papacy could be toppled in a heartbeat. The next act is ceremonial degradation. Formosus is pulled from the throne, gently enough not to dismember him, but with no attempt at reverence. He's placed upright, though upright is a generous term when the body sags at joints that no longer cooperate. The papal seat he once occupied is left vacant, an empty symbol of how far he's been cast down. The crowd shifts restlessly. The moment has shifted from shocking to morbid, and now to something darker still. Whispers flit from mouth to ear, speculating on what might happen next. Some swear this is a cleansing of the church. Others mutter that it's a curse waiting to rebound on everyone present. Then the sentence moves beyond words and robes to the most physical of symbols. The right hand of Formosus, the one used for blessings, is extended. The fingers are taken one by one in a gesture steeped in canonical tradition. It is supposed to be symbolic, but when performed on a corpse, it carries an edge of desecration that even some of Stephen's allies seem to regret. There's no blood, only the soft thud of what's removed being set aside. And yet the basilica seems to hold its breath, as though the building itself understands this is no ordinary trial, no ordinary punishment. When it's done, the attendants step back. What sits before the assembly now is no longer the Pope, no longer even the defendant. It is a man reduced to a cautionary object, a reminder that in Rome, memory can be rewritten not just in words, but in actions. The trial dissolves into murmurs, the crowd breaking apart in small knots. Some leave quickly, eager to put distance between themselves and the sight they've just witnessed. Others linger, staring as though trying to memorize the details for retelling later. And Stephen 6? He leaves without flourish, without looking back. The performance has ended for today. But even as the basilica empties, you sense the final act is still waiting. The one that will remove Formosus from sight entirely, but not from Rome's restless imagination. The verdict had been delivered, the humiliation made public, and yet Stephen 6 wasn't done. In a city like Rome, erasing an enemy meant more than stripping titles. It meant removing them from the stage entirely, even if the stage was a tomb. By late afternoon, the basilica had grown quieter. The crowd had thinned to only the most stubborn onlookers, the kind who can't turn away from a slow-burning scandal. The sunlight slanted through the high windows, dust drifting lazily in the beams, giving the place an almost serene glow. If you ignored the fact that in the center of it sat a pope's corpse, just sentenced and degraded before the eyes of Christendom. The attendants moved with renewed purpose now, as though eager to close the book on this spectacle. They lifted Formosus from the throne, the chair creaking in relief, and set him into a plain coffin. No fine wood, no decorative carving, just rough boards, nailed together in haste. It was a coffin meant for transport, not veneration. Historians still argue about what happened next, because accounts differ. Some say Stephen ordered the body reburied in a common grave outside the consecrated papal cemetery, a final insult to his memory. Others claim the coffin was not meant to touch earth again at all, that Stephen wanted it gone, removed from the city like a stain from a cloth. What is certain is that the final journey was not discreet. Guards carried the coffin out through the Lateran doors, down the stone steps, and into the streets. There was no funeral procession, no chanting of psalms, only the shuffle of boots and the creak of wood. A few onlookers followed at a distance, their curiosity outweighing their sense of propriety. The path wound toward the Tiber, that slow, broad artery of Rome that had swallowed more than a few political problems over the centuries. The river's edge was cool in the late day, the smell of water mixing with the faint tang of refuse that drifted along its banks. Here the attendants paused, their breaths visible in the shade, and waited for the signal. Stephen's order was simple. The body of Formosus was to be cast into the river, not lowered, not hidden. Throne. The symbolism was sharp enough to cut. The Tiber had long been Rome's silent accomplice in making inconvenient things disappear. Tossing the former pope into its murky waters was a way of saying, he is nothing now, and the river will take him as it has taken others before. The splash was louder than you expect, echoing off the stone embankments. The coffin bobbed once, twice before tipping to one side and vanishing beneath the surface. The ripples spread outward, catching the last rays of sunlight before fading into the sluggish current. And just like that, the trial was over, not only in the basilica, but in Rome's streets. For Stephen, it was a full stop, the kind of ending meant to be permanent. But endings in Rome are rarely as final as the ones you plan. Already, whispers began to spread that casting a pope into the river was an affront too bold to go unanswered. Some claimed the Tiber would carry his curse through the city. That misfortune would follow those who had touched him. Others said they'd pray for the river to give him back, so the injustice could be righted. Stephen VI might have thought he'd finished the story, but what he'd really done was release it into the bloodstream of Rome, where it would keep moving, keep changing, and, if the rumors were true, eventually resurface. The Tiber has a way of keeping secrets until it doesn't. Days pass, then weeks, and the city settles back into its uneasy rhythm. Traders hawk their goods in the forum, bells toll the hours for mass, and Stephen VI goes about the papal business as if the cadaver synod were simply one more administrative duty crossed off his list. But in Rome, nothing that outrageous fades quietly. People still murmur about the trial, about the sight of the corpse in papal robes, about the fingers. Even those who supported Stephen find themselves telling the story with a mix of awe and disbelief, their voices dropping at the stranger parts, as though afraid the very stones might be listening. And then it happens. The river gives him back. Whether by the hand of God, the quirks of the current, or the meddling of unseen sympathizers, Formosis's body resurfaces downstream. The details vary depending on who's telling it. Some say fishermen found him tangled in their nets, his vestments clinging like faded banners. Others claim children spotted him along the bank while chasing each other through the reeds. But in every version, the reaction is the same. Shock, followed by a creeping sense that the trial's sentence had been rejected. Historians still argue about whether this was a natural event or an early piece of political theater from Formosis's allies. The Tiber was known to return the occasional body, especially if it was caught in an eddy or lodged against debris. But to the people of Rome, the explanation didn't matter. What mattered was the symbolism. The Pope who had been cast out had come back. The news spreads faster than wine at a wedding. Within a day, people are making pilgrimages to the spot, some to gawk, others to kneel and pray. Whispers of miracles begin. Someone swears the body's hand looked as if it were giving a blessing, even without its famous fingers. Another claims the river water around him was clearer than anywhere else along the bank. Stephen VI can't ignore it. The reappearance fuels the belief that Formosus, even in death, still carries divine favor. It undermines the entire point of the cadaver synod, turning a display of papal dominance into a lingering embarrassment. The trial had been meant to erase his legacy. Instead, it has made him more present than ever. The body is retrieved and, according to sympathetic clergy, reburied quietly, this time in consecrated ground. No public announcements are made, but enough people know to keep the legend alive. And with the legend comes the dangerous thought that perhaps Stephen VI had overreached, that perhaps he had mocked not just a man, but the sanctity of the papal office itself. Late at night, in the taverns and kitchens of Rome, people begin to say it openly. If the Pope could do this to a predecessor, what might stop him from doing it to anyone who stood in his way? That thought doesn't sit well, even among his allies. The river had returned Formosus, but the city was beginning to return judgment on Stephen VI. The shift begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a change in the wind before a storm. Stephen VI still appears in public processions, still presides over Mass in the Lateran, still signs decrees with the authority of St. Peter's successor. But the way people look at him is different now. Respect is there, but it's colder, edged with wariness. The murmurs have become harder to ignore. In the streets, the Cadaver Synod is no longer just an event. It's a nickname for his entire papacy. Cadaver Pope, some call him behind closed doors, the words carrying a mixture of mockery and disbelief. The trial, once a show of dominance, has become a story passed in kitchens and marketplaces with a shake of the head and a muttered, "What was he thinking?" Historians still argue whether Stephen understood how badly the spectacle had backfired. Some believe he saw the backlash coming, but felt trapped by the Spoleto faction's expectations. Others suggest he believed Rome would forget in time, underestimating the persistence of its gossip network. But forgetting is not in the cards. The reappearance of Formosus's body had been bad enough. It was like the Tiber itself had rebuked the verdict. Now, sympathetic clergy quietly rehabilitate his reputation. They whisper to parishioners that the former pope had been wronged, that his acts in life were valid, that his enemies had staged a farce to erase him. Pilgrims begin to visit his new burial place in secret, leaving offerings or simply kneeling in silent prayer. And then the political tide starts to turn. The Dukes of Spoleto, whose backing had made Stephen's papacy possible, are losing their grip on influence. Other factions in Rome, sensing weakness, begin to push back. What had been a united front in favor of the Synod starts to fracture, the cracks widening with each week that passes. It's not just politics, it's the atmosphere. In the Basilica, during services, Stephen can feel the weight of stares from both clergy and laity. In private meetings, bishops speak to him with careful, measured tones, as though testing how close they can skirt the topic of the trial. His own guards, loyal in name, exchange glances when his back is turned. The whispers grow sharper, that he's unfit to rule, that he's cursed, that he's mocked the dignity of the papal seat and invited divine punishment. Even the superstitious begin to avoid crossing his path, muttering prayers when they do. One night, a rumor slips through the city like smoke, that a group of bishops is quietly organizing to depose him. In Rome, such talk is dangerous, but it doesn't take root without fertile ground. And in the wake of the Cadaver Synod, the ground is rich with discontent. Stephen VI had tried to bury Formosus twice, once in the ground and once in public opinion. Both times, the effort had failed. Now it is his own position being dug up, examined, and increasingly found wanting. Rome wakes as it always does. Bakers pulling loaves from hot ovens, vendors shouting over figs and olives, church bells marking the hours. But the city feels tilted. The Cadaver Synod isn't just an event anymore. It's a nickname clinging to Stephen VI like damp cloth. People don't need to whisper about it now. They talk in half laughs, head shakes, and a tone that says, "Can you believe we saw that happen?" Stephen tries to act as though nothing has changed. He processes through the Lateran with full regalia, his gaze fixed ahead, but the weight of the crowd's stares has shifted. Respect is still there, but it's brittle, like glass that's been tapped once too many times. The synod, meant to be his triumph, has become an anchor dragging him down. Historians still argue whether Stephen realized how badly he'd overplayed his hand. Maybe he believed Rome's attention span was shorter than it was. Maybe he thought fear could outlast mockery. But power here is a tide. It doesn't matter how firmly you plant your feet if the water turns against you. It does. The uprising isn't gradual. One moment Stephen is pope. The next he's a prisoner. Guards loyal in name alone turn on him, stripping away not just authority but protection. The halls of the papal residence echo differently when you're being marched through them in chains. He doesn't last long behind bars. Strangled in his cell, his death comes without ceremony, and the city moves on with the same weary shrug it's given a dozen power shifts before. New popes arrive in dizzying sequence: Romanus, Theodore II, John 9, each trying to steady the papal ship. Romanus distances himself from the synod. Theodore returns Formosus's body to St. Peter's with honors, and John XIX seals the reversal with councils that annul Stephen's rulings and forbid trials of the dead entirely. It's like the church drafting its own never again clause. For a moment, it feels as though the scandal might finally sink into the silt of the Tiber. But Rome's currents have a habit of circling back, and under the surface, new factions are already gathering strength. The stage that saw Formosus rise, fall, and be tried in death is far from finished with its actors. You'd think that after the councils of John XIX, the matter would be sealed like a tomb. But in Rome, seals are just invitations for someone else to pry them open. The ink on the No Trials for the Dead decree is barely dry before the city's political weather starts shifting again. Clouds rolling in from the south and from within its own walls. Enter the Theophylacti family, powerful, wealthy, and skilled in the art of making themselves indispensable to whoever sits on the papal throne, or in replacing them if they don't. Their influence seeps into every corridor of authority, from the basilicas to the barracks. This is the beginning of what later chroniclers will call the Saeculum Obscurum, the dark age of the papacy, though gossip-mongers with sharper tongues prefer the rule of the courtesans. Quirky tidbit: some even claim you could track papal succession by which Theophylact Salon was most fashionable that month. Into this atmosphere steps Sergius III in 904. His rise is steeped in rumor. Whispers that he once had a hand in the Cadaver Synod, or at least stood close enough to nod approvingly during its proceedings. Historians still argue whether he was truly a judge at that macabre trial, or merely a political ally of those who staged it. Either way, his papacy reopens wounds Rome thought it had bandaged. Sergius doesn't exhume Formosus again. No one is quite ready to reenact that scene. But he does quietly reverse much of John IX's rehabilitation. Ordinations made by Formosus are declared invalid, a move that ripples outward like a stone tossed into a crowded fountain. Priests find their status questioned. Bishops are forced to reaffirm their positions. And the whisper network reignites with talk of curses and vendettas. The atmosphere in the city grows unsettled. Clergy argue over which papal names to include in the canon of the Mass, afraid that today's approved might be tomorrow's condemned. Monks copying chronicles hesitate over how to describe Formosus. Write him as honored, and you risk angering the current pope. Write him as disgraced, and you offend the many who still venerate him. It's like living in a story where the ending keeps being rewritten and the ink never dries. For ordinary Romans, all this papal seesawing blurs into the rhythm of survival. Bread still bakes, marriages are still blessed, children still chase each other around columns older than their family names. But the undercurrent is clear. The papacy, once a symbol of stability, now feels like another factional prize to be won, lost, and fought over. And somewhere in the minds of those who remember the synod, not the sanitized version, but the sight of a pope in papal robes, long buried on trial, there's an unshakable thought. If Rome could do that, there's no telling what might come next. The cadaver synod never really leaves Rome. Even as decades pass, and the names of popes change like the seasons, the memory clings to the city like damp on stone. Ask a merchant in the Forum or a pilgrim at a roadside inn, and they'll tell you their version, some with a shiver, others with a grin, as if it were just another Roman oddity like crooked streets or stubborn mules. Historians still argue what the synod truly meant. Was it a grotesque one-off born of political spite, or a symptom of a deeper rot in the church's foundations? For some, it's the ultimate cautionary tale about power, how far it can reach and how far it can fall. For others, it's proof that Rome's love of spectacle sometimes outweighs its sense of shame. What's undeniable is the market left. The image of Formosus, dressed in papal finery, seated on a throne he could not see, hear, or feel, became a symbol far beyond the trial itself. To his supporters, he was a wronged pontiff whose dignity outlived his accusers. To his enemies, he was a warning that death didn't erase judgment. And to the rest of Rome, he was a story to be told again and again, proof that the city could outdo even its own legends. The later popes would tinker with his legacy, rehabilitating him, condemning him again, restoring him once more, until the truth became a palimpsest of edits. One quirky tidbit: in some parish lists, Formosus's name appears with tiny marginal notes debating whether to pray for him or not, as if the centuries never quite settled the matter. Even today, the Cadaver Synod sits at the crossroads of history and theater, an event so bizarre it feels half-invented. But it happened, and in the way Rome remembers it, half-gasp, half-smirk. It reminds you that history isn't just written by the victors. Sometimes it's written by the survivors, who can still tell the tale without flinching. The trial ended more than 1,000 years ago, but the basilica still stands, and the Tiber still moves with the same slow patience. Somewhere in those stones and waters, the echo of that day lingers, faint but impossible to silence. So here, at the soft edge of the story, you let the noise of the synod drift away. The marble floors are empty now. The candles burn down to stubs. The heavy scent of incense faded into the cool air. You picture the basilica at night, its vast nave quiet, shadows pooling in the corners, the echo of footsteps long gone. Outside, the Tiber slides past in the dark, carrying only the reflections of lanterns along its banks. It's easy to imagine the city asleep, its tangled history resting for a few hours before morning stirs it awake again. You think of the countless days and nights that have passed since the synod. Markets opening, bells ringing, lovers meeting in narrow alleys, rain washing dust from the stones. The sharp edges of the trial blur here, as if time itself has sanded them down. What's left is a story both strange and human. Ambition, pride, vengeance, and the need to make a point so loudly that it echoes for centuries. You can almost hear the quiet murmur of the river telling it over and over, patient as ever. And maybe that's the real ending, not in verdicts or decrees, but in the way the story has lived on, in the way people lean in when they hear the first line, in the way they shake their heads at the last. For now, you let the final image fade. Rome under a silver moon, the basilica silent, the river steady, and somewhere in the folds of the city's memory, a throne facing a throne.